thank you very much, and thank you for your very kind welcome, and thank you all for coming to listen to me. As Bill said, I've been writing about the existence of God for a long time. I've been writing about other things as well, but I've been writing about inductive arguments for the existence of God for a long time.
Sorry, we're going to push the mic down a little bit and closer to you.
And what I'm going to give you now is simply a very short version of the kinds of things that I have said. I've said it at book length, I've said it at short book length, I've said it at article length, I've said it at 5-minute interview length, and I'm going to give you a 3/4 of an hour length presentation of this. If any of you know or are familiar with...
Due to technical difficulties, I'm sorry. Apparently this mic works better.
Okay. If you have difficulty in hearing me at any time, please wave and tell me. If any of you are familiar with some of my work, you won't find anything very novel in what I'm saying, but I hope this is an occasion for you to raise objections to it, and questions, Q&A is meant to include substantial objections to what I'm saying. I hope you've all got a handout. You'll need it to follow the sequence of the argument. St. Paul famously claimed that pagans who did not worship God were, quote, without excuse, because ever since the creation of the world, God's eternal power and divine nature, invisible though they are, have been understood and seen through the things which he has made, close quote. Inspired by this text, many Christian thinkers from the 2nd to the 18th centuries put forward arguments from premises evident to the senses to the existence of God. To address such arguments is to do natural theology. My own natural theology is inductive, unlike that of Anselm. That is to say, it seeks to show that the evident phenomena, the things that are most obvious to us, are best explained by supposing that God causes them, and that makes it probable that there is a God. The fact they're best explained in this way makes it probable the explanation is true. In this lecture, I shall have time to consider only the inductive force of 4 very evident general phenomena. First, that there is a physical universe. Secondly, that it is governed by simple natural laws. Thirdly, that those laws are such as to lead to the evolution of human bodies. And fourthly, that those bodies are the bodies of reasoning humans who choose between good and evil. And you will find these 4 things under E in the penultimate paragraph on the handout. That's my evidence, E for evidence. I shall not in this lecture discuss arguments against the existence of God, such as the argument from pain and suffering, but I will do that in a lecture tomorrow. Theism, the claim that there is a God, is, among other things, an explanatory hypothesis, one which purports to explain why certain observed phenomena, that is, data or evidence, are as they are. There are 2 basic kinds of explanatory hypothesis, what I call personal and what I call inanimate or scientific hypotheses. A personal hypothesis explains some phenomenon in terms of it being caused by a substance, that's a thing. I'm using the word substance as a philosopher's technical term for things like persons or desks or planets. A personal explanation explains some phenomenon in terms of it being caused by a substance, a person, acting with certain powers to bring about effects, certain beliefs about how to do so, and a certain purpose or intention to bring about a particular effect, either for its own sake or as a step towards a further effect. For example, I, a substance, a thing, cause the motion of my hand in virtue of my powers to move my limbs, my belief that moving my hand will attract your attention, and my purpose to attract your attention. I explain this in terms of persons who did it, their powers, their beliefs, their purposes. By contrast, an inanimate or scientific explanation is usually represented as explaining some phenomenon in terms of it being caused by some initial state of affairs and the operation on that state of affairs of laws of nature. For example, the present positions of the planets are explained by their earlier positions and that of the Sun, and the operation on them of Newton's laws, because Newton's laws operated on the Sun and planets as they were last year. That made them move in such a way that they are where they are. But that way of analyzing inanimate explanation as laws acting on particular things, substances, seems to me a misleading way of analyzing that kind of explanation, because laws aren't things. The world isn't full of laws. To say that Newton's law of gravity is a law of gravity is simply to say that each material body in the universe has the power to attract every other material body with a force proportional to mm-r squared, that is, proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart, and the liability to exercise that power on every such body. So construed, like personal explanation, inanimate explanation of some phenomenon, such as the present position of the planets, explains it, once again, in terms of it being caused by substances, the Sun and the planets, acting with certain powers to cause the material bodies to move in a way codified in Newton's laws, and the liability always to exercise those powers. So, both kinds of explanation explain phenomena in terms of the actions of substances having certain powers to produce certain effects. But while personal explanation explains how substances exercise their powers because of their purposes and their beliefs, inanimate explanation explains how substances exercise their powers because of their liabilities to do so. So those are the two kinds of explanation we use all the time for mundane phenomena. This was brought about by a person because he believed and had such and such purposes. That was brought about by a substance exploding in virtue of its powers to produce an explosion and its liability to do so under certain conditions. This is the way we explain things in one or other of these ways. The next question is, why should we judge a postulated explanation, a postulated hypothesis of either kind, as probably true? What are the grounds for supposing that some explanation of a phenomenon is brought about by me for certain purposes, or some explanation of the planets being where they are, or whatever, is the true one? And I suggest that we judge a postulated hypothesis of either kind as probably true insofar as it satisfies 4 criteria. And these are on your handout, and they are at the top of your handout. First, we must have observed many phenomena which it's quite probable would occur, and no phenomenon which it's quite probable would not occur if the hypothesis is true. The phenomena must be such that you would expect them if the hypothesis were true, and you wouldn't expect them otherwise. Secondly, it must be much less probable that the phenomena would occur in the normal course of things, that is, if the hypothesis is false. Thirdly, the hypothesis must be simple, that is, it must postulate the existence and operation of few substances, few kinds of substances with easily describable properties correlated with each other in few mathematically simple kinds of way. That's a long and complicated sentence, don't worry, it'll be spelt out in a moment. We can always postulate many new substances with complicated properties to explain anything which we find, but our hypothesis will only be supported by the evidence if it's a simple hypothesis which leads us to expect the various phenomena that form the evidence. And fourthly, the hypothesis must fit in with our knowledge of how the world works in wider fields. what I shall call its background evidence. Right, now I'm going to illustrate these criteria at work in assessing postulated explanations. I begin with a postulated personal explanation. Suppose there's been a burglary. Money has been stolen from a safe. A detective has discovered 3 pieces of evidence. First, John's fingerprints are on the safe. Secondly, someone reports having seen John near the scene of the burglary at the time it was committed. And thirdly, there is in John's house an amount of money equivalent to the amount stolen. The detective put forward as the explanation of the burglary, you guess, the hypothesis that John robbed the safe. The hypothesis that John robbed the safe in virtue of his normal human powers, in the light of his belief that there was money in the safe, having the purpose of getting the money. So our 4 criteria we're now going to be seen are well satisfied in the case of that purported explanation. Because, first, if John did rob the safe, it would be, to some modest degree, probable that his fingerprints would be found on it. It would be, to some extent, probable that someone would report having seen him near the scene of the crime at the time it was committed, and also that money of the amount stolen would be found in his house. So the phenomena are indeed such as, not certainly of course, but with a modest degree of probability, you would expect to find if the hypothesis is true. But these phenomena are much less to be expected with any modest degree of probability if John did not rob the safe. There's no particular reason to expect these phenomena if the hypothesis were false. They therefore constitute positive evidence, evidence favoring the hypothesis. On the other hand, of course, if John did rob the safe, it would be most expected, for example, that many people would report seeing him in a foreign country at the time of the burglary. Such reports would constitute negative evidence, evidence counting strongly against the hypothesis. So let's suppose for the moment there is no negative evidence. The more probable it is that we would find the positive evidence if the hypothesis is true, and the more improbable it is that we would find that evidence if the hypothesis is false, the more probable the evidence makes the hypothesis. Those are the first 2 criteria, and this hypothesis satisfies them very well. But a hypothesis is only rendered probable by evidence insofar as it is simple. Suppose, for example, that John is brought to court and has a defending barrister, defending lawyer, I should say. And so the lawyer says there's another explanation of all these phenomena. The explanation is David stole the money, quite unknown to David. George dressed up to look like John at the scene of the crime. Tony planted John's fingerprints on the safe just for fun. And, unknown to the others, Stephen hid money stolen from another robbery, coincidentally of exactly the same amount, in John's house. Now note, if this complicated rival hypothesis were true, we would expect to find all the positive evidence which I have described, just as on the original hypothesis. And it remains not nearly as probable that we would find them otherwise. So the first 2 criteria are satisfied equally well. But the rival hypothesis is not very probable. The evidence does not make it in the least probable. And the reason it doesn't is because that relative to the detective hypothesis, this rival hypothesis is extremely complicated. The detective's hypothesis postulates only one substance, John, doing one action, robbing the safe, which leads us to expect the various pieces of evidence, whereas the rival hypothesis, which I have set out, postulates many substances, many persons doing quite different unconnected actions which lead to the phenomenon. So this rival hypothesis does not satisfy the 3rd criteria at all. But as well as evidence of the kind which I have illustrated, there may be background evidence. That is, evidence about matters which the hypothesis does not purport to explain, but which comes from an area outside the scope of the hypothesis. We may, for example, have evidence about what John has done on other occasions. Suppose there may be evidence making probable a hypothesis that he has often robbed safes in the past. This latter evidence would make the hypothesis that John robbed the safe on this occasion much more probable than it would be without that evidence. Conversely, evidence that John has lived a crime-free life in the past would make it much less probable that he robbed the safe on this occasion. A hypothesis fits with such background evidence insofar as the background evidence makes probable a theory of wider scope, for example, that John is a regular safe robber, which in turn makes the hypothesis in question more probable than it would otherwise be. So I've shown you how, in the case of a personal hypothesis, these criteria enable us to recognize a correct explanation, or rather a probably correct explanation. The same four criteria are at work in assessing postulated inanimate or scientific hypotheses. Consider the hypothesis that Newton's theory of gravitation explains the many phenomena known in 1687 when Newton proposed his theory. Newton's evidence consisted of evidence about the paths taken, given certain initial positions, by our moon, by the planets, by the moons of the planets, the velocities with which bodies fall to the Earth, the motions of pendula, the occurrence of tides, etc. Now, Newton knew lots of data about all these things. Newton's theories consisted of his three laws of motion and his inverse square law of gravitational attraction, that all bodies attract each other with forces proportional to the product of their masses and inversely proportional to the square of their distance apart. And I won't run through the three laws of motion, but they're very simple laws. Newton's theory consisted of the three laws of motion and the inverse square law of gravitational attraction. Given these laws make it very probable that the observed phenomena, which I've listed, such as the positions of sun and planets 500 years ago, would be followed by the various present observed phenomena, such as the present positions of the planets. It would be very unlikely that these phenomena would occur if Newton's theory were not true. There was no significant evidence, negative evidence. The theory was very simple, consisting just of his four laws, the mathematical relations postulated by which were very simple. F equals mm-over r squared is a very simple law, and even simpler are the three laws of motion. Nevertheless, innumerable other laws would have satisfied the first two criteria equally well within the limits of accuracy then detectable. Any law in which you substitute a slightly different value for the 2 in mm-over r squared, r to the power 2, you substitute a slightly different value for the 2, which is so slightly different that it doesn't make any difference to the observations within the degree of accuracy then measurable. For example, suppose you substitute for the 2.00000974, that would also have satisfied the criteria just as well as did Newton's law. So too would a theory which postulated that the inverse square law held only until the year AD 2969, after which quite a different law, a cube law of attraction, would operate. Or there could be a theory containing a law that quite different forces operated outside the solar system to those which operated within it. All these rivals to Newton's laws would have got exactly the same observational results. But of course, the rivals which I've suggested, and there could be an infinite number of other ones, would be less simple than Newton's laws. less simple because 2 is a simpler figure than 2.0000974. And I mention here, and I'll come back to this, some numbers are simpler than other numbers, and one number that's a very simple number is the number 0. But we'll come back to that in a minute. A law which holds that only one mathematical relation operates is simpler than a law containing two different mathematical relations between material bodies. For example, the law holding a law which was a combination of a law saying this part held until 2969 and a different part held after it. So you could construct innumerable different mathematical theories which produce just those data. And I've suggested a couple of ones which are a bit more complicated than Newton's, but you could have innumerable ones. And if I had a blackboard, but it doesn't matter, you can illustrate this point if you consider that the task of a scientist is to find the value correlating to variables. And suppose you have on the board a diagram of a graph with an x-axis along here and a y-axis along there, and you want to know what is the value correlating these two variables, and you mark on the graph cases where you have observed for a particular value of y a certain particular value of x. And you find that when y equals 1, x equals 1, and when y equals 2, x equals 2, and when y equals 3, x equals 3, and so on up to 6. And so you naturally think the equation correlating them is the equation x equals y. And therefore you would mark on your graph a line through the points x 1, 1, 2, 2, 3, 3, and so on. But you could draw an infinite number of different lines which pass through the 6 mentioned points but diverge in various ways. And that illustrates the point that for any finite collection of data, there will always be an infinite number of theories which predict those data, but the only one that's likely to be true is the one which is simple. So, I stress the crucial criterion of simplicity. I add two background evidence. We saw there was background evidence in the case of the detective, in the sense that there were wider fields in which we ought to take into account how things behave. But when you're dealing with a scientific theory which purports to explain most things in the universe, you may not have any wider background evidence. When Newton's theory was produced, there was no theory of electromagnetism or of any other serious phenomena apart from those of mechanics, and therefore, as it were, there was no background evidence with which it had to fit. And so that's why Newton's theory was regarded as very probable, because it has a simple theory which led you to expect data which you otherwise wouldn't expect, and it didn't need background evidence. And rephrasing it in a more satisfactory way, the theory is, Newton's theory is, the hypothesis that the sun and each of the planets have certain powers, the ones which are codified in Newton's laws of attracting each other in various ways, and therefore it's probable that with a given setup, a certain other setup will follow, and the data are that in the cases observed, that is how it is. I stress once again that without the criterion of simplicity, it would be impossible to predict anything beyond what we immediately observe. You just observe data, you have to extrapolate from them to the future, but you can extrapolate in complicated or simple ways. And for theories which have a very wide purport to explain more or less everything, there won't be any background evidence with which to fit. You just have to go for the simplest theory, and that's what Newton did, and that's what today's scientists are trying to do with a lot more data, and go for somewhat more complicated theories, because a very simple theory won't fit the data in that case, but they're going for the simplest of the theories they can produce, which would explain those data. Right, those are the criteria for the probable truth of some postulated explanatory hypothesis. I come at last to God. I now spell out the hypothesis of theism. Theism is the view, the doctrine that there is a God. Now, this is clearly a personal hypothesis. It is, in fact, the hypothesis that's on your handout under H, and I'm now going to spell out H on the hypothesis. You'll see that what I have done is, at the top of the hypothesis, state those 4 criteria, state how they work in formal ways, and I've stated to you what is the evidence I'm going to consider. Under E, I'm now going to consider the hypothesis of theism and see how well it explains the evidence which I have described. Theism is clearly a personal hypothesis. God is supposed to be a person, or something like a person, who is essentially omnipotent, omniscient, perfectly free, perfectly good, and everlasting. If, when I describe God as a person, you are worried about the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, that there are 3 persons of one substance, you must regard these arguments as arguments to the existence of God the Father, on whom the other 2 persons ultimately depend. So it's an argument to a person, a personal being, who is essentially omnipotent, that is, can do everything, omniscient, knows everything, perfectly free, nothing makes him do things, perfectly good and everlasting. That is the hypothesis. A person is a being who has powers, as we have seen, to perform intentional actions, that is, actions which he or she means to do, who has powers, beliefs, and purposes to choose among alternative actions which to perform. It is simpler to suppose that the cause of the universe has 0 limits to its power, that is omnipotent, rather than that the cause of the universe can only make a universe of a certain size and duration. You may remember a few minutes ago I pointed out to you that the number 0 was a very simple number. Simple because if you can understand the notion of 1, you can understand the negation of the notion that there is no 1, in other words, 0. And the hypothesis of an omnipotent being is the hypothesis that there are 0 limits to his power, and therefore that is a simpler hypothesis than the hypothesis that the God in charge of the universe is big enough, has enough power to make a universe of this size, but not any bigger. So the hypothesis of an omnipotent God is a simple hypothesis relative to the hypothesis that there's a God of limited power, and it's a simpler hypothesis relative to the hypothesis that there are many gods, polytheism. An omnipotent person can do any logically possible action, that is, any action which can be described without contradiction. An omnipotent person cannot make me both exist and not exist at the same time, but since it makes no sense to suppose that I could both exist and not exist at the same time, a logically impossible action is not really an action at all, any more than an imaginary person is really a person. So, God, I'm spelling out the hypothesis. I'm not saying it's true or anything at the moment. I'm just spelling out what it consists in. And it says there's an omnipotent being in charge, and that means a being who can do anything, description of which does not involve a contradiction. A truly omnipotent being would not be subject to irrational forces informing his powers, as we are so often. We are influenced by irrational desires in various ways, but a truly omnipotent person would be free from those. He would be influenced by reason alone, and that means by what he believes good to do. And in that sense, a perfectly free and omnipotent being is necessarily perfectly free. A truly omnipotent person would know all the possible actions open to him, and so know whether they are good or bad. And so, being perfectly free from influence to do what is bad, recognizing something as good, he would do what is good. So he would be perfectly good. So, it follows from his basic omnipotence that he will be perfectly free and perfectly good. Excuse me. But then, what does God's perfect goodness involve? So often there must be before God, as there are before us, a choice between equally good, incompatible good actions. We often have the choice of giving to this charity or that charity. They're both deserving, but maybe the sum of money will only do any good if we do the whole sum to one charity. So we are faced with two equally good actions to do. And God, no doubt, is often in that position. But since God is omnipotent, the range of incompatible, equal best actions available to him would be so much greater than the range available to us. Further, God must often be in a situation where we cannot be, of having a choice between an infinite number of possible actions, each of which is less good than some other action he could do. For example, elephants are good things. They can be happy and loving. So the more of them, the better, given that they are spread out among an infinite number of planets so as not to crowd each other out. So however many elephants God creates, God would believe it better if he had created more. So he can't do the best, because there isn't a best. It may be, however, that where there is no best or equal best action available to God, there may be a best kind of action available to God, such that it's better to do some action of that kind than to do any number of actions of any incompatible kind. For example, God can create creatures of many different types, including angels, humans, and animals. If it were the case that it would be better to create at least some humans, even if he creates no angels or animals, than to create any number of angels and animals and no humans, or to do an action of any other incompatible kind, then it would be a best kind of action for God to create some humans, although there would be no best number for him to create. In that case, I suggest, God, being influenced by reason alone, would inevitably create some humans. And if there are two or more equal best kinds of actions available to him, he will inevitably do some action of one of these kinds. Since God's omnipotence only requires him to do the logically possible, the obvious way to understand God being perfectly good is that he will inevitably do the best or equal best action, or, if there is no such action, an action of the best or equal kind, and even if that's not possible, some good action, but he would never do a bad action. So what I've been doing is, we say God's perfectly good, and that means he's guided by reason alone, by the goodness of what he proposes. But I pointed out that cannot mean that he always does the best, because there may not be a best. And I've pointed out what perfect goodness must amount to. It must amount to doing the best where there is one, doing an equal best where there is an equal best, doing a best kind of action where there is a best kind of action, an equal best kind of action where there is an equal best kind of action, but otherwise an only good action, any good action. God's perfect goodness follows from his omnipotence. That is to say, it follows, by the steps I've argued, from the fact that no external forces act upon him. He just sees the reasons for things and acts in accordance with them. Given the logical impossibility of backward causation, that is, causing the past, God will not be able to cause past events, but he will be able to cause any logically possible future event. But in order to be able to know which future events are logically possible, he needs to know everything that has happened in the past. For what has happened in the past puts logical limits on what can happen in the future. For example, God cannot now immediately bring about a Second World War because such a war has already happened, and he cannot immediately bring about a Fourth World War because a Third World War has not yet happened. So he needs to know the past in order to know what he must do he can do in the future. But of logical necessity, his knowledge will be confined to knowledge of the past and of any not necessary truths. He cannot know the future, for that will depend on his own future choices. Hence, just as omnipotence is to be understood as the power to do anything logically possible, so omniscience should be understood of knowledge as knowledge of anything logically possible to know. And the future is not logically possible to know for God because it will depend on God's own future choice. So once again, I've been spelling out, and now I've developed a bit further, what the traditional properties ascribed to God amount to, what being omnipotent amounts to, what being perfectly free amounts to, what being perfectly good amounts to, and now what omniscience amounts to. And I've derived them all from his being omnipotent, and I now add his everlasting omnipotence, that is to say, his always being omnipotent. It follows, all of that follows just from his having those two properties. And for that reason, I conclude that theism is a very simple hypothesis indeed. It postulates just one substance, God, having essentially the simplest degree of power, zero limits to it, and lasting for the simplest length of time, zero limits to it, and from that follow all the other essential divine properties. God being what he is in virtue of these essential properties makes God a person in a sense somewhat analogical to the sense in which we are persons. Theism is such a wide-ranging hypothesis, it purports to explain all the most general features of the universe, that there is no background evidence. All the evidence, whether positive or negative, is within its scope. So I've been arguing the hypothesis of theism satisfies the third criterion, simplicity, supremely well, and it doesn't need to satisfy the fourth criterion because, like an enormous scientific theory, there's nothing it purports that is outside its scope. So the issue as to whether the hypothesis of theism is probably true depends on how well it satisfies the first two criteria, which you will remember are a matter of whether the phenomena are such as you would expect if God was the cause of them, and you would not otherwise expect. So, first, are the phenomena such as if there is a God, it would be probable that he would bring them about? His bringing them about will consist, I should add, if he brings about the universe, it means that he causes its existence, not necessarily, it may have existed forever, but in that case he causes its existence at each moment while it exists, or if it's only existed a finite time, then he's caused the beginning of its existence and its continuing existence. So the hypothesis is that God brings about the universe, brings about the way things in the universe behave, that is to say, makes the universe consist of substances with the powers that they do have, brings about that those substances have the powers to bring about other substances which eventually bring about human beings, human bodies, and brings about that those humans are conscious. That is what the that is what the hypothesis claims, and it's a simple hypothesis. Question is, if it's true, would you expect to find these hypotheses? If it's true there is a God, would you expect to find that he would produce the universe like that? If there is a God, he will seek to bring about good things. It is good that there should be a beautiful universe. Beauty arises from order of some kind, and the orderly interactions and movements of objects in accordance with natural laws is beautiful indeed. And even more beautiful are the plants and animals which evolved on Earth. Animals have sensations, beliefs, and desires, and that's surely a great good. Humans have the power to reason and understand the universe, and that's an even greater good. But all of these kinds of goodness are kinds of goodness which God himself possesses. God is beautiful. God has beliefs. God has desires. And he has the power to reason and understand. That is to say, if it was only animals and plants and inanimate things, they have good characteristics, but these are characteristics of which God himself has more. But there is one kind of great goodness which God himself does not possess. That is the power to bring about either good or evil. God can only bring about good. Yet it would be very good indeed that there should be persons who have the free will to make this all-important difference to the world, the power either to benefit or harm themselves, each other, and creatures, to have the power to be mini-creators, as it were, to form the world in a certain way, but not in the way that God himself wants them to do, or rather, God hopes, of course, that they will do that. But like a good parent, he would want them to have the opportunity to rebel. And God himself does not have the power either to do good or evil. But it is a great good that there shall be beings of limited power who can do that, who can help to form the universe this way or that way. And so, if there is a God, we have very good reason to suppose there will be persons who have, as I believe humans have, that freedom. They are unique. The animals don't have that freedom. God doesn't have that freedom. There's a great good which would otherwise not be manifested unless God made humans. But of course, there's clearly a bad aspect to the existence of humans. They may cause much evil. So it cannot be a unique best action to create such persons. But in view of the unique kind of goodness which they would possess, surely it must be at least an equal best action to create such persons. And if so, it's as probable as not that if there is a God, there would be such persons, that is, persons like us humans. But if God is to create us, he must provide a universe in which we can exercise our choices to benefit or harm ourselves and each other. We can only do that if we have bodies through which we can learn about the world and make a difference to it, and places where we can get hold of each other or escape from each other. So there has to be a physical universe. But only if there are comprehensible regularities in the way things behave in that physical universe, regularities which we can discover, will there be ways in which my doing this or that will make a predictable difference to me or you, and only thus can we have a choice of how to treat each other. Only if humans know that by sowing certain seeds, weeding and watering them, they'll get corn, can they develop an agriculture. And only if they know that by rubbing sticks together they can make fire, will they be able to burn the food supplies of others. That is to say, if there aren't regularities in the behavior of things, what we do is not going to make a difference to other people, and we shan't therefore have the power to influence them for good or evil. But comprehensible, observable regularities are only possible if the fundamental laws are simple ones. Further, if God is to create embodied humans, the laws must be such as to allow the existence of human bodies. either brought about by an evolutionary process or created directly by God. And finally, human bodies only have a point if they are controlled by conscious persons. So the four phenomena to which I have referred are to be expected. That is, it's quite probable they will occur if there is a God. I have been talking about how well the hypothesis of theism satisfies the first criterion, and I've argued that if the hypothesis is true, it is to be expected that we would find the four phenomena which I have listed. So what about the second criterion? If there is no God, is it probable these phenomena will occur? My answer is, it is immensely improbable that these phenomena will occur under those circumstances. It is enormously improbable that each of the innumerably many fundamental particles, or rather chunks of compressed energy immediately after the Big Bang, should just happen to exist. And it's even more improbable that each such chunk should behave in exactly the same fairly simple way as each other chunk. The way is codified, we now know, not so much by the law of gravity, including the law of gravity, but more generally by the laws of relativity and quantum theory and the other three forces. That is to say, the datum is that each particle in the universe, electron, proton, whatever, behaves in exactly the same way as each other particle, in that, in the case of the law of gravity, it exercises on each other particle the force laid down in Newton's law of gravity. And insofar as it's a charged particle, it exercises its attractive or repulsive powers in accordance with the law of electromagnetism, and so on. Every particle behaves in exactly the same way as every other particle. And what's the odds of that, unless somebody made them like that? The odds are unbelievably small. So, while there are fairly simple laws governing the universe, as it were, what the laws consist in is that each particle in the universe behaves in exactly the same law-like way, and that is very, very improbable. And even if such an enormous coincidence occurred by chance, it's immensely improbable that the laws, that is to say, the ways that each particle behaves, it's immensely improbable that those laws should be such as, together with the boundary conditions of the universe, should have given rise to human bodies. That is to say, you could have a very orderly universe governed by very orderly laws, but which never threw up human beings. But in fact, the regularities codified in the powers and liabilities of the fundamental particles are such as at some time in the evolution of the universe they throw up these bodies. They are fine-tuned to do so, as modern science has pointed out. That is to say, if the constants in the laws of nature or the values of the density or momentum of the Big Bang had been different from what they were within the most apart in a million, humans would never have evolved. As some of you probably all know, the current scientific theory is that the universe started, or at any rate our present state of the universe started, with a Big Bang 13.5 billion years ago. And the Big Bang itself was so fine-tuned in the sense that if it had been a bit bigger a bang, all the matter would have flown out in different directions and would never have consolidated so as to produce planets on which we live. If the bang had been a tiny bit smaller, all the matter would have collapsed on each other so that we'd never have evolved, we'd just be squashed. And the laws of gravity and the other three forces are laws in which there is a constant, that is to say the force between particles, F, is G, which is a constant, times mm dash over r squared. and constants can be measured by different scales, but on a certain scale the value of G is 32. And what the fine-tuning this amounts to is if that had been, instead of 32, 31.99, we'd never have evolved. And if it had been 32.01, we'd have never evolved, and so on, and similarly for the other constants. So, immensely improbable there'd be particles at all, immensely improbable they'd be behaving in exactly the same way, immensely improbable that same way would have thrown up us, and as far as any plausible scientific laws are concerned, the laws might easily give rise to robots. That's to say, all the laws physics deal with are such as would throw up bodies which behave in a certain way. But they would do that whether the bodies were bodies of conscious beings or not. We might as well be zombies as far as the laws of nature are concerned, the sort of physics deals with. So there has to be an extra vast number of set of laws connecting our bodies with our conscious life, or which God has to provide in the way of giving our bodies power to be conscious, and again, immensely improbable that would happen. So, I'm suggesting to you, it is immensely improbable if there is no God or anything like it, then it's immensely improbable that there would be these four pieces of evidence. Now, some contemporary physicists will tell you that we live in a multiverse, such that many different possible universes with different laws of nature and different initial conditions will eventually occur, and so it's not surprising that there's one like ours. There are various forms of multiverse theory, but they have this sort of form, the form that once upon a time there was a vast sea of energy, floating energy, as it were, and from time to time it consolidated and produced big bangs. But the big bangs were of some were bigger than others, and some led to particles having laws of nature slightly different from others. And so physicists will say, well, there are the energy sea throws up innumerable universes, different universes, with different laws of nature and different initial conditions. Those will eventually occur. So it's not surprising, says the scientist, that there's going to be one like ours. If you toss a coin 1,000,000 times, then all sorts of very unlikely sequences will occur. So if you toss a universe, as it were, 1,000,000 times, something like ours is bound to turn up, says the scientist. So it's not surprising that there should be a universe like ours. However, our only grounds for supposing that there are these enormous number of universes, that's to say a multiverse consisting of all such universes, is going to be if the theory that there is such a multiverse, or rather the theory which has the consequence that there is such a multiverse, is the simplest theory that which could explain certain observed physical phenomena which we observe. That will only be if the simplest laws of nature, which we will observe by observing all sorts of things through the telescope and in our labs, are such that we learn that the laws of nature are such as to throw the most general laws of nature are such as to throw out different universes in different places. So our only grounds for supposing that there are universes with other laws of nature than the ones that govern us is if it is true that there are even more general laws of nature which govern the multiverse as such, and which, as it were, crystallize out in different universes in different ways. But then, what the multiverse theory is committed to is that the whole multiverse, that is to say all the universes are governed by exactly the same very general laws of nature, which throw up different variants in different places. So it is committed to postulating that not merely all the particles of our universe, but all the particles of all these universes that form in the multiverse are themselves, in their most general way, behaving in exactly the same way, and that is even more surprising. Furthermore, most logically possible multiverses would not throw up anywhere a universe which is such that it will eventually throw up ours. One can imagine many different multiverses which throw up many different sorts of universe, none of which will produce creatures like us. So it has to be a rather special sort of multiverse that throws up a universe like ours, and it would have to have very general laws which are exemplified in innumerable different particles in order to do so. So I would conclude that even if, and who knows, even if our universe does belong to a multiverse, it is very improbable that the multiverse is such as would eventually lead to us somewhere or other. So I don't think the possible existence of a multiverse makes much difference to the force of the argument which I've discussed. The second criterion is very well satisfied by theism, whether or not there is a multiverse. So what I have been trying to persuade you of is that these four general phenomena, which are obviously true, nobody could doubt the phenomena, they're facts they're phenomena which are so obvious to us that we don't pay attention to them, but they're there, and they might very well not be, and we wouldn't be here to observe that, but they might very well not be. And so we ought to consider, why are things like this? If we can explain why things are like this, we should do so. And there is a hypothesis which explains very well why things are like this, and it's a very simple hypothesis. It's the hypothesis of theism. So, if you're scientifically minded and inclined to believe hypotheses because they satisfy these sort of scientific criteria, you ought to believe that the most general phenomena should be judged in the same way, and that will lead you to the existence of God. And that is facts.
I didn't mean to be the first one. Let's get this party started. I have one question in 14 parts.
No, short questions, please, short questions.
I kind of have a two-part question.
Wow.
But it's all about simplicity. So I'm confused by or troubled by arguments to God's existence that rely on simplicity, because it seems like either way that you go, you end up losing out. The last part of your argument relies on the fine-tuning argument, right? If I don't grant you that, if I object to that, which I think there's some pretty good objections to the fine-tuning argument having to do something that you pointed out about the scales of measurement, it looks a little bit more remarkable if you use certain scales and not others. So if I don't grant you that, then you've got to make God the simpler hypothesis compared to naturalism. And that's going to be really hard to do because God is an extra substance, a very large extra substance that naturalism doesn't have. And so it looks like you're going to lose out on simplicity, right? If I grant you the fine-tuning argument, then the God that you're defending here, the triomni God, the perfect version, right, is going to have to be the simplest compared to other possible beings that might have created the universe, right? That's going to be really hard to do as well, it seems. Now, what you've tried to do is make the triomni God the simplest because there are zero limits to his powers and zero limits to the time, the amount of time in which he exists, compared to other gods that would have lesser powers, right? But this seems a very slippery move, because when I talk about the things that I do, I don't start listing off the things that I don't do. right? Whenever I start listing off the hobbies I have, I talk about solving Rubik's Cubes and playing the drums and flying kites. I don't mention that I don't collect stamps, I don't do this, I don't do that, I don't do these other things, right? If we're talking about gods and what powers they have, we list the powers that they have. What you have chosen to do is take your God and say, I'm going to describe his power by saying what he doesn't have. And that's 0 things. He doesn't have 0 things. And so
I think you've made quite a point which I'd like to answer before I forget what it is. Indeed, I've forgotten your first point by now. Let's come to this second point. Now, suppose you collect stamps on Wednesdays and on Thursdays and on Fridays and on Saturdays and on Sundays and on Mondays and on Tuesdays. You wouldn't say, my hobbies are collecting stamps on Mondays and collecting stamps on Tuesdays and collecting stamps on Wednesdays and so on. You'd say, my hobbies are collecting stamps. And that's because there's a general description which fits all of that thing. And if you have other hobbies which can, as it were, are all subtypes of a general type, you would mention only the general type. And that's why we don't, if God can do everything logically possible, that is the natural description of it, not listed in 101 different ways, of which are species of the possible.
Well, no, but the natural description of it is to say that he has infinite power. And he exists for an infinite amount of time. That's the most natural way to describe it. But when you describe it that way, it's very obvious that that God is not the simplest being.
Well, wait a minute. Right? You must, for the sake of other people, you must just let me answer the question, and then we'll let someone else in and let you in a moment. Now, my answer to that, I didn't use the word infinity, you're quite right. And the reason why I didn't use it is because what I'm considering is the infinite amounts of a property as opposed to infinite number of things. If I'd started talking of infinite number of things, then we get into all sorts of difficulties about cardinalities in infinity. But there is a simple way of describing infinite power, and that is to say there are no limits to it. And that's things should be the simplicity of something I'm postulating should be judged by the simplest way of expressing it. And this is the simplest way of expressing it, and that comes back to the earlier point you were mentioning about there are different scales on which you can measure how fine-tuned the universe is. But some of these scales are pretty artificial and others of them are pretty natural. And you should use the simplest way of expressing the scale. And the simplest way of expressing the scale is the one in which the formula of the law itself obtains the simplest form. So that's my answer to it. Now, in fairness to, and unfairness to you, but fairness to me, I'm giving me the last word because I am answering your question. So I'm sorry, you may not consider that an adequate answer, but you've had your say, and can we let the next one in?
Absolutely. I don't consider it adequate, but I thank you for your answer. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Swinburne. I was interested to hear you say that you deny that God's omniscience includes prescience or foreknowledge. And if I understood you correctly, you suggested that there is a logical contradiction between the idea of God having foreknowledge and God's ability to act freely in the future. Was that the source of the contradiction?
Yes.
So, I guess my question is, why can God not simply know God's future actions by knowing God's will, by knowing God's own will? And to sort of flesh this out, if we consider God to be immutable and the immutability of God as part of God's simplicity, then would it not seem to be a natural extension of that God's will would also be immutable?
If you say God is immutable, one needs to specify in what respect he is immutable. He is immutable in his essential properties. He is immutably omnipotent, omniscient, etc., etc. But that doesn't mean to say that he doesn't do one thing one day and a different thing another day. I think it's pretty obvious he does do one thing one day and a different thing another day. And certain medieval philosophers who tried to avoid this were avoiding it unnecessarily, I think. It seems to be a good feature of God that he does one thing one day and another thing another day. If he was timelessly outside the scheme of things, that would seem to be a less perfect God from my point of view. But at any rate, coming back to your main question, let's put it for the moment in terms of his knowledge of our free actions. Now, why God can't foreknow infallibly? Of course he can. Pretty well, he knows the probabilities we do this or that. But he doesn't know for certain for this reason. If it really is in the power of a human to do A or not A at some future time, then if you say God foreknows what we would do, then you imply that he has a certain belief at the earlier time about what he will do. And whatever belief he has about that, if it's really open to us to do what we do, then it's open to us to make that belief false. And that is incompatible with his omniscience. If he knows whether or not I'm going to mow the lawn, then he must have a belief about it. And if his belief is that I am going to mow the lawn, then when I decide what to do the next day, I have it in my power, I would have it in my power to make that belief false. And that is not something one wants to say about God. That we can show in that sense what he believes to be a certain knowledge to be false. God knows our propensities, our weaknesses, and so on. And I always quote in this connection Genesis 6:6. Now, many of you who know your Bible backwards will know what Genesis 6:6 is, but I wonder if anybody knows what Genesis 6:6 is. No? Well, I'll tell you. It's just before the story of Noah. And the world has become very wicked, and God reflects on that, and Genesis 6:6 says, God regretted that he had made the world. Now, if you take that in any way literally, clearly didn't foreknow how things are going to happen. And applying it as I did, not so much, not to knowledge of us, or what we would do, but apply to knowledge of what he himself will do. Of course, like us, he can resolve at a certain time to do a certain thing, but he can change his mind if he wants to. And there are accounts in the Bible of where he does change his mind. The story of Jonah seems to be an example of that. He tells Jonah to predict, to prophesy to Nineveh you will be destroyed, but Nineveh surprisingly repents, so God changed his mind and did not bring about the evil which he had predicted for them. So he can, of course, decide at a certain time that he will do that, but there's nothing wrong with changing your mind about something, unless you promise someone who won't, of course, and that's a special case. But so he would, if he foreknew everything, he would foreclose his ability to react to us in the way that we believe he does. I mean, the typical picture of God interacting with humans is God tells us to do this, then we don't do it, then God is angry, then we say we're sorry, then God forgives us. That's to say, there's an interaction all the time in which we are doing one thing and he is reacting to it. And that is a picture of a God who is deciding in the light of how we behave what he will do. And if you think of him as someone who knows all the answers in advance, then you are saying that he isn't a God we can interact with, and that's why I stick to my guns there.
Thank you, Professor Swinburne, for your lecture. My question has to do with your utilizing science in your cumulative arguments and how you utilize it today. Because you usually speak of law-like nature of quantities or entities in the phenomenon that we experience, and that law-like nature pointing to the lawgiver God himself, and in all the arguments in your books and so on. And I'm just wondering, because of what I would assume is your commitment to scientific realism, that science does describe the world or the phenomenon that we observe, that it has representational power.
Yeah.
How would you respond to someone who is perhaps a non-realist when it comes to science and mathematics, who sees science as not having that kind of representational power, science as an artifact of culture, science as something that is constructed by human communities or the community of scientists, and science having value but not any metaphysical value per se, i.e. no representational value. It has pragmatic value, perhaps. It has constructed value, or someone like Bas van Prassen, who proposes a constructive empiricism, someone who does not subscribe to the no miracles argument of Hilary Putnam or so on. Someone who looks at the value of science and sees it along pragmatic lines and not along intrinsic lines, that science gets us to the way things are.
Well, first I would say just how non-realist this person is. If he thinks that we can't possibly predict, if he thinks that there is no justification for working out whether a bridge will fall down or not fall down by using the laws of mechanics, that this is just artificial and conventional and so on, then he ought to believe that for example, if you walk out of the window, you're just as likely to rise upwards as fall downwards. And he ought to believe that there's no reason to suppose that things will behave in the same sort of regular way as they have behaved. If he really thinks that, then, I don't have anything to say to him. But I don't believe anybody does really think that. And if they don't really think that, if they think that, as it were, we do know how things are going to behave tomorrow, then the only issue is how realist are you going to be about science? Are you going to suppose that they're really atoms and so on, or they're only the things we can observe, and that the regularities aren't sort of invariable, they're a bit statistical? And I'll say, okay, but nevertheless the world is a very regular place all the same, and then the argument takes off.
If I can just ask a quick question. I think a scientific realist, as I explained, of course I don't have time to really elaborate, but as I understand it, does not deny phenomenon, scientific phenomenon, but redescribes it in non-metaphysical terms. So he looks at it from an epistemological standpoint, but does not know what the ontological thrust is. The ontology is the part where he or she is not sure.
Okay, well, it doesn't matter whether you believe that there are electrons or not. All of my argument depends on is the regularity of the most general phenomena we can observe. But of course I've phrased it in that way because I think these days almost everybody is a scientific realist, and that's the way I put it. But the argument is just as forceful. It can be presented in the 3rd century AD as much as in the 21st. You put it in terms of their science or of no atomic theory or anything. Yeah. I'm sorry, I've been talking about scientists, and there is a real and distinguished scientist present, and I think he'd like to say something. I think,
Take this question and then Dante.
yes.
So you placed a lot of stress on the point that God's omnipotence only requires him to do the logically possible, right?
Yeah.
I'm wondering then if the limits of logical possibility possibility. The limits of logical possibility, are these independent of God, or can they be explained as deriving from God in some way that wouldn't make them the product of his free choice?
In my view, logic is simply the rules for the use of human words and sentences in such a way that you can convey useful information by them. That is to say, there is said to be a law of logic that not both P and not P. In other words, something can't be the case and not be the case at the same time. And this is regarded as a tremendous metaphysical law which governs everything and seems to threaten God's omniscience and so on. I don't think that's the way to regard it at all. It's a rule for the use of not in English. And it says that if you don't assume that, then your language isn't going to be much use to you. If you're to say, if you're to tell somebody that today is Wednesday and your use of the word not is such that it doesn't rule out the word, it would also be true that the world is not, that today is not yesterday, not Wednesday, then your language is not going to convey any useful information. So we have all sorts of rules which ensure that when we say things, we do in fact convey useful information, and the law of non-contradiction is one of those laws, and the law of the excluded middle in a certain form would also ensure that. So I don't think there are any timeless rules of logic. What there are rules are as to whether human sentences do in fact convey information, and what I am saying is God can do anything which we can describe in such a way that it isn't self-contradictory. Any weakness, as it were, God not being able to do something, the weakness is not in God, it's in the human sentence that doesn't express anything. That is my answer. Now, a real scientist will take over.
Okay, yeah, thank you very much. It's a great honor to be able to have you here and meet you. And I do very strongly affirm your emphasis upon the value of simplicity in choosing hypotheses. I mean, that's very much central to science, and we often call it Occam's razor and the like. And so, you know, I'm extremely sympathetic to that sort of thing. There was just one point here I thought that I don't think you had time to mention in your talk, and I just was curious as to how you might expand it. Near about 60% of the way down at the bottom of the biggest paragraph, you said, and I'm going to focus on this part that's set off with the dashes. You say, God is one person, and since all his other properties follow from his essential everlasting omnipotence, the simplest kind of person there could be who would bring about E.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you could elaborate a little bit more why all the properties of God, including, I think you mentioned any essential properties of God. Why do all of the properties of God follow from just these essential properties?
Yeah, sure. I thought I had done that, but I probably went through it too quickly. I emphasize essential properties. What I mean by an essential property of anything is a property which, if it didn't have it, the thing couldn't exist. That's to say, it is an essential property of this lectern that it occupies space. If it ceased to occupy space, it would cease to exist. So what we're concerned with, and it's an essential property of a human being, that they are capable of being conscious. If you cease to be capable of being conscious, you're dead. You don't exist. Now, what we're concerned with is the essential properties of God, and I wanted to argue that everlasting omnipotence is enough to generate all the other traditional essential properties of God. And this is the way it went. An omnipotent God is able to do anything. Now, you could construe omnipotence, or you construe someone having power in such a sense that they have power if they're able to do something, but they don't know what they can do. That is to say, you might say of somebody, he has the power to talk English, he has the power to lift a weight of 30 pounds, but if he doesn't know that he has that power, he's not, there's something deficient about his power. At any rate, I am construing omnipotence in such a way that omnipotence is not merely the power to do anything, but the power to be able to choose to do anything, and that you can only do if you know what the choices are. Now, in order to know what the choices available are to you, you must know, however you construe them, the laws of logic. That is to say, you must know that it isn't in your power to make a thing exist and not exist at the same time. And more generally, you must know all the necessary truths. Furthermore, you have to know everything that's happened in the past. For this reason, because among the things, the choices you will otherwise think you have in the future are, and this was the example I used, you might think you have the choice of whether or not to bring about the Second World War. But of course you don't have that choice because it's already happened, and nothing that given the logical impossibility of backward causation, nothing God can do. He doesn't have that power to bring it about because it's already happened and there it is. Likewise, he doesn't have the power immediately to bring about the Fourth World War because he can only do that if there's already been a Third World War, so he has to make that happen before he can bring about the Fourth. Now that's just one example, but it does illustrate that everything that's happened in the past can affect the kind of actions that are open to him in the future. And therefore, unless he knows everything about the past, he will think that he could do certain things in the future, which in fact he can't. So it follows from omnipotence construed as the ability to choose and execute any possible choice, that he must know what are the possible choices, and that means that he must know all the truths of logic and all the past. Now, I'm as it were, you can construe omnipotence in a very narrow way so that it doesn't include knowledge, but that seems a bit unnatural, and it's certainly not the way omnipotence has been generally understood. And you could say that someone was omnipotent if they could do anything, even though they didn't have the power to choose to do it. And that would also seem to be a mistake. More generally construed, it must involve the power to choose to do that thing. And in that case, if you were subject to external desires, then that would be influencing your choice. Your choice would be restricted in a certain way if you were forced from outside to do it, or even if you were subject to a temptation from outside to do it. So an omnipotent being must be free from external irrational influences. He must only act in virtue of what he sees to be. He must only act on reason, that is, on what only he acts in virtue of what he sees to be the state of the case, and that alone influences him. And therefore, if he sees that something is good, he will be moved to do it, because you can't really believe some action is good unless you have some inclination to do it. Of course, we are subject to all sorts of contrary influences and temptations, so we don't always do the good. But if you didn't have any contrary influences and temptations, and you really believe this was a good act, you'd automatically do it. So inevitably, he will, being uninfluenced, he will do what is good, and I tried to spell out what that would amount to. So perfect goodness and omniscience follow. perfect goodness, omniscience follows, perfect freedom follows, and from perfect freedom and omniscience you get perfect goodness. So that's the way the argument went. Now, it does involve construing omnipotence in a fairly full way, so that it involves ability to choose to do things as well as to do things, and it involves being entirely uninfluenced by anything outside. But that's a very natural way of construing omnipotence, and so that's the argument.
Is it as a simple hypothesis that maybe the word essential was missing from the sentence?
Oh, I'm sorry, is that? Yes.
Since all his other, I thought you were perhaps claiming that all of his other properties, but you're arguing that all of his other essential properties.
Yes, I'm very sorry. If I left that word out, it certainly should be there. I'm sorry.
Okay, that was my confusion.
Yeah. No, indeed not. Most of the properties that God might have, such as the property of bringing us into existence, are matters of choice and not essential to him. Yeah. I don't know how many more questions you want, but...
Can we take 3 more?
Yes, so long as they're short ones. And then one question, yeah.
I'm sure.
Yeah.
Just 1 minute. So it seems to me like we could mean 2 things when we deny the existence of God. One, and I think that informs what we could mean when we affirm the existence of God. So on the one hand, we could be meaning something like, out of the set of all things that exist, God is a member of that set, right? So to deny that God exists would say, out of the set of all things that exist, God is not a member of that set.
Yeah.
That's a very analytic way of talking about it. But then, on the other hand, there's this Nietzschean way, and I'm thinking about the parable of the madman, where, if God is dead or if God doesn't exist, everything changes, and the structure of reality sort of falls apart, and you have to redefine all these things, and he uses language like floating through an infinite nothingness, and lighting lanterns in the morning hours, and I think that seems to me like a very different kind of denial of the existence of God. I just want to know, what do you make about that?
Well, I don't go along with Nietzsche, and I can't give much sense to the sort of worldview which he is commending to us. It seems to me that most people in the English-speaking world today know perfectly well what they mean by there is no God. They mean what you said in the first sense. And I think only someone who had read something like Nietzsche would go along with the second sense. Now, that may be my firm allegiance to clear ways of thinking in the analytic tradition. In that case, well, there's more in the world than my philosophy will allow of, but it seems to me they mean the first to almost everybody these days, but I could be wrong.
I apologize if I'm shivering in the cold. I'm sitting right under.
Yeah, it is a bit.
So I'm just going to, ultimately, we're taking knowledge from the Bible, as you brought up Genesis 6, to bring up some of the reasons why we're using these words. Okay, so we know that the Bible explains how we're meant to understand God, and by knowing God that we will have everlasting life. So, and one of the ways to do this is that you have to believe in Him and you have to have a relationship with Him. So, does it follow a perfectly good God? One, just in the last sentence, you asked something that was good, He would be moved to do it. I'm wondering how, sorry, I've also missed another bit. You did say about the omniscient. He might not be completely omniscient of the future, but He does know our strengths and our weaknesses. So I'm just trying to understand how or why God then, perfectly God, good God, would choose to allow non-resistant non-believers.
Yes, that is, I think, a question outside the scope of what I was talking about. I mean, it implies you're bringing in what you think are certain Christian doctrines and asking me to comment on that.
But you're using your background evidence from the Bible to...
Oh, I see. No. I was just I was giving a general argument for the existence of God, and I was making some consequences, and I was pointing out that these consequences are something that Christians or will find in their Bible, but that wasn't my evidence for them. My evidence for them is here.
Okay. I understand my question comes from listening to the answers.
Yes, I'm sorry if I gave the impression that my view about the nature of God depended on the Bible. My view on the nature of God depends on this. My view about the Bible being true or otherwise depends on whether it fits this rather than the other way around.
So really it doesn't matter if we believe or not.
Oh, that's a very different question. You're asking me for certain views about certain Christian doctrines, and I think that's well outside the scope.
Fair enough.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I just try to put this in as succinct a question as possible, but do you think the fact that God likes beauty, you pointed that out a couple of times, do you think that's why things might seem inefficient in their design to us with our limited perspective?
What sort of things are you thinking of? Mosquitoes? I mean, that's sort of...
That's a great one. No, like theists, like Christians, like we sometimes point to, say, the complexity of the design of the eye. I've mentioned that to atheist friends. Their response is the way the eye is designed. Actually, there's way better ways it could have been designed. So it's just like the way I hear it described, though, it's like it just sounds more complex the way an artist might do something because it looks cool to them. Like, I don't know.
I don't think I have any view about that, I'm afraid. I don't know enough about the eye, but it's a pretty good tool when we've got it, and I think some eyes look to me pretty beautiful. We certainly can't see the beauty of all things, but what I was commenting on is the, as it were, overall beauty of the heavens before ever there are plants and animals and planets around. And you only have to look at the night sky, especially through a telescope, and especially, as it were, speeded up over time, to recognize that here is a great celestial dance. That's all I had in mind. Right. One more.
Hi, this is less of a rebuttal and more just a straight up question. I'm wondering, given what you've said this evening, which argument you believe of yours is the weakest and why?
Well, I think the argument from there being a physical universe at all is probably the weakest. What is most compelling is the regularity in the behavior of the bits of it, as it were. But all the same, I think it very surprising that there should be all these bits, and I can explain why, because we need bodies and we need things behaving in a regular way in order to affect other people and so on. But that they should exist just like that is pretty strange. But you can't get nearly as much of an argument out of that, which is often called the cosmological argument, as you can out of the regularity, which is a very, very striking feature of that universe. So that's the answer.
Okay, I have the mic. Can we ask one more question?
Oh.
A common argument against the existence of God is, well, if God created the universe, who created God? Would you care to comment on non-contingency, the aseity of God?
Briefly? I think I would prefer not to comment on that for a simple reason. In any field of activity, whether A is a good explanation of B is a matter of whether it satisfies my criteria. Whether or not you can explain A itself is not a feature here, doesn't enter in. Also, clearly I would say that in all explanation you have to come to a stop somewhere. You can explain A by B and B by C and C by E, and if my argument is correct, you're looking for the simplest starting point. This is either a brute fact, that's just how it is, and there's nothing inadmissible in saying that, you know, everything is due to this and this is the ultimate fact. But it may be that there is some deeper explanation of this. It may be that there is a sense in which God is the cause of himself, but it wouldn't be a normal sense of cause quite, but it might be something analogous to that. But whether I can answer that question or not is irrelevant to the argument for his existence.